Hello, everyone. My name is Mudassar. I'm the head of technology engineering at Lambda Test, and it's great to see so many of you for a thought-provoking session at the TestMu conference 2024. Today, we're going to dive into a topic that surely, would add a lot of value in terms of your quality assurance uh, concepts and thought process. Today, our speaker, Melisaa Tondi, brings a wealth of experience in quality engineering and leadership. Melisaa is head of technology at Campminder and is also a principal consultant at Disrupt Testing. She's here to help us rethink automation, what truly it is, and what's important and what's not. As we go through the session, feel free to drop in your questions in the chat, and we'll be happy to take it at the end of the session. Now, let's get ready and hear out Melisaa and enjoy the session. Over to you, Melisaa.
Thank you. And I hope everyone is enjoying this really excellent conference here. The quality of the speakers and the content that I've seen, I can't wait to get the recordings of all those. So I'm hoping you're having a great time just as I have. So we're going to dive into automation and why I think we might be doing it wrong, or how I've personally done it wrong in my past. So the idea, and I believe why most of us attend these conferences, and certainly for those of us who speak at conferences, most of it is so that we can share our failures sometimes and successes with you, so that you can tap into our minds. And especially when something may have been as a result where it didn't quite come out as we had expected it to, we want you to learn from our mistakes so that perhaps you don't have to do those as well. So we're going to jump into automation. So first of all, I understand, automation, we're doing it wrong. Sounds like a little bit of a negative type of context there. But really, the idea is that innovation should be at the forefront of what we do. If we are technologists, which I believe everyone attending this conference is a technologist, we want to make sure that when we build on our successes and most importantly our failures, innovation tends to come up to the top. And that's what really is the catalyst for us to make process improvements, for us to think about new or emerging technologies or ways and approaches of doing things. So the idea, and a lot of my talks are based off of how can we be efficient in what we're doing, and most importantly, to understand that even best laid plans, the right processes or approaches or tools or resources that we've put in place over the years of our career probably made a great deal of sense at the time. If we are not also revisiting those processes and approaches and tooling and resources that we put in there at a decent amount of time on a recurring basis, we're giving ourselves honestly a disservice. So things that we should be looking at when we look to revisit those things are those processes or approaches still applicable today? Do they, if they were put in place 5 or 7 or 10 or 15 years ago, or even last week or last quarter, are they still applicable today? Do they still meet the outcomes of our original intent in putting those in place? Do they align with our industry? This is one of the best places to see whether or not something aligns with our industry, because we have so many folks that make up our industry. We have industry experts, we have industry thought leaders, we have people who are new to our industry or emerging or progressing through our industry. These conferences and the sharing of information is one of the best places for us to really ensure that those things do align with our industry, as well as other async or non-conference related things. And then the last point really here is probably the most important. Are they agreed to by those expected to do the work? It's really easy, especially for those of you who are leaders or managers or leads of teams. It's the easiest way to put out a process is to do it unilaterally, where it belongs to you and you roll it out and you set the expectation that everyone is supposed to adhere to it. That's the easiest way for you as a manager or leader to get a process out. The better, or probably the right way to do that, is to make sure that if we put an expectation, for somebody to do that work or to adhere to that process, that we have that agreement, not necessarily buy-in, because we will not necessarily always get buy-in every time we put a process or an approach in place, but at least there's an agreement with a good discussion to ensure that we've captured anything that might be a got you or something that might need to be addressed in that process. So when we think about why am I being so negative in that title of that we're doing it wrong, it's really so that we can elevate the conversation and make sure that we have the right framework in place in order to quickly, efficiently address anything that might not be relevant for those things that were relevant when they were put in place. So let's jump into it. So this is one of my favorite quotes. Many years ago, this quote came out of a great opportunity that I had to build essentially a QE R&D team around mobile testing. And this was when mobile was right at the forefront, where companies were now trying to figure out what was the approach for mobile, how disruptive will this be? Do we have to hire specialized folks and stuff? And so I was offered an opportunity to build and run what we essentially called an R&D lab around mobile testing. And one of the things that, as we were talking about mobile and the support that automation specifically provides for mobile permutations, devices, all that, the quote here: test automation makes humans more efficient, not less essential. And we are all human. Well, at least I assume we are. But if you're not a human, please raise your hand and we'll make sure that we exit you out of the conference. Just kidding, obviously. But this quote really is important because there are a lot of misperceptions on what test automation's outcome is or what we should see from it. And I will share a story shortly with you. But a lot of those have been around, that if we just put, for those of you who've been in your career maybe 15 or 10, 15 years or more, when commercial tools were, one of our only options for test automation, there was absolutely an opinion that if we invested hundreds and thousands of dollars into commercial grade test automation tools, that the outcome would be less testers and less QA. So if you happen to be in your career as a tester when we started making those shifts, or where tools and companies started investing in commercial tools, there might have been a little bit of concern on whether or not you were going to have a job after that, especially if you might not have been perceived to have the skill sets in order to use those commercial tools. So that quote really grounded us. And this really grounds us with not only test automation, but really any tools or resources there. We want to always optimize the times when the humans are interacting with something or providing a solution. Because as we know, the best tool that we can have to our advantage is our brain, the one that's right here in between our ears. And so when we think about tooling, and especially when we think about test automation in particular, we really want to make sure that we keep the humans at the forefront, and that we as technologists, human technologists, we are not only adopting but embracing tools and technology so that we can always engage our brain at the right and appropriate times and really dig into those things that probably shouldn't or couldn't or won't be used from some sort of a tooling standpoint or in the overarching umbrella of automation of processes as well as tests. So let's talk a little bit about that. So a story. So I'll talk about my story. So about 12, 14 years ago, I had one of the greatest opportunities to move into the head of quality engineering for a global company. And so I had the great fortune of having lots of teams spread out across North America as well as Southeast Asia. So all in all, we had about 150 quality engineers that supported our software developments for this company. And so when I was promoted into a director of engineering, a quality engineering role, I took almost 100% of my direction from my CTO, because of course my CTO gave me that promotion. What wound up happening was that we got caught up into that role of, hey, we are spending about $300,000 a year on this test automation commercial tool. And that's a big investment for a company. And so what wound up happening is that I was given the mandate or the edict to have an appropriate amount of people that would be eliminated from our staff by implementing this test automation commercial high grade tool. So I'm probably not going to need to go into the details, but you can probably understand where that wound up happening. Um, as I had taken my direction from the CTO who was signing the check to the vendor to purchase this tool, there was an expectation that I would be laying off a certain number of engineers throughout the next year in lieu of having this tool in here. So when the word got out, of course, and of course, as my team, brand new leader, getting in front of my team and explaining why we were investing into test automation and having such a high dollar budget item on this tool, I had many great people leave my team or leave the teams at that point because what wound up happening was that I was so overshadowed by my CTO telling me that we needed to adjust the number of people with the cost that we were putting into this tool that we actually lost the great people or a lot of the great people. And so when I think about this story, we were able to quickly kind of readdress that. And after we were able to show why people were leaving or giving in their resignation, we were able to quickly pivot and really put together an approach that I took a little bit more responsibility on, which is that I wound up including now and how we implemented that. So, in my quest to meet the numbers in automation, it resulted in me taking action before really thinking it through. I was excited. I was a brand new engineering leader with a lot of responsibility. And I did what I had done up to that point, which was rely on my leader, my manager, to give me that advice without really treating that as a collaborative relationship. I felt compelled to say yes to everything that he told me to do. But really, what he wanted me to do was share my opinions and, in some cases, call out where perhaps an instruction that he had given me might not work. I didn't do that. I took action before I thought it through. And then I wound up managing the teams or the team by a metric that really didn't add much value. What value really was it to save salary or contracting money that were employing humans with brains over the fact that we were putting a lot of money into this commercial grade test automation tool? And what wound up happening was that I forgot and I wound up losing some really great humans in the process. And so, again, if you look back to the mistakes that a lot of us have made, which I'm sure many, many of the speakers are sharing those mistakes, hopefully you won't repeat those. But there's always a good part of the story because we were able to come back, pivot back, and we were able to, in some cases, save some of those folks. Some of them wound up actually coming back to our company once that mission and the values that we were adding were clear and concise, and that I was able to grow into my newly formed leadership position. So, where did we go wrong? So, the first thing that we were trying to do, and again, remember, automation, why we're doing it wrong, right? So, where did we go wrong? Or where did we as a company, where did Melisaa go wrong? And perhaps where did our industry go wrong? So, a lot of times we created these monolithic suites of tests, right? And this may sound very familiar to you. We create and run these big kind of multi-hour suites. We generally run those off hours or overnight. It's very typical to kick off a job, say at 6 p.m. local time, and then have those run through several hours, sometimes 12, 14 hours. And then we see the results magically the next morning, assuming that there were nothing that happened overnight or when those suites of tests were run. But really what wound up happening was that when we came in the next morning after that big monolithic suite of tests were run, we usually call them regression suites or something similar. The results are really vetted out by a small group. In some cases, it was likely only a QA or QE person or the QA or QE team that was vetting out those small results, because in some cases we didn't really trust the results. We knew that those results, if we were to put it into a team channel outside of QA or QE, that it would be very noisy, because a lot of times we'd spend several hours, a lot of times in the morning, really trying to troubleshoot what those issues or errors were. And so we decided, well, we don't want the rest of the team to hear those noise. So we're going to take one for the team and have all of that noise and the vetting through and the troubleshooting happen with this very small group of people, or in some cases, one person responsible for that, right? And then as actions needed to be taken, we needed to address those issues or errors. That same action would be taken by that same person or that very small team, and usually in a silo. Oh, I need to update this script. I need to do this. I need to change this. I need to do that. And all of that work and information was really being done in that silo without the benefit or the collaboration with the rest of the agile or project team. So that probably sounds very familiar to you, because that is a very, very familiar situation. And in a lot of cases, you may be experiencing that today. So, how do we make that right, that wrong right? So, I like to call it multiple runs for multiple duns. Instead of having this huge, large, monolithic suites of tests that, again, run overnight for many hours during the day, very hard to troubleshoot. 6 hours of a or more of a test suite run in the morning when it's all finished or supposedly finished with a lot of errors, right? So the idea is multiple runs for multiple duns. Well, what's the multiple duns here? So if we start looking at smaller, centralized, and centralized is the key word here, more efficient suites of tests that provide more concentrated and quicker feedback to the whole team versus just the QA or the QE team that originally created those automated scripts or those suites of tests. We want to make sure that they're running in the pipeline at all times, and that the results are available and actioned on by the team versus that small group of people or that one person that's responsible for checking out all the failures, right? So if you want to make that right, that monolithic suite of tests done so that we don't have to run it off hours because it is so cumbersome and large and monolithic, think about looking at it from a different view. One way that we look at this is that we try and create suites of automation that are organized around how our dev teams are organized. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. And I mentioned a little bit earlier that that centralized definition, it was really important. Centralized in this term means that it's centralized so that anyone on the team, not just the QA or QE folks, have the ability to kick off those suites if they have that skill set or if they have the permissions or ability to do so. And that those results are centralized and available to the entire team for further action. We've tended to put a lot of our test automation into that silo of a Slack channel or some other way that's not accessible for the rest of the team because we want to be cognizant of the noise that that might call. A lot of times, by calling out the noises in there, we are actually tapping into the many brains of our test of our team rather than just a small or group of folks or one person that is responsible for that. So we want to make that monolithic suite right, we look at the multiple runs for the multiple duns type of approach. So, where did we go wrong? Number two, automate everything. For those of you who were familiar with when the DevOps kind of approach and mindset kind of came into mainstream companies several years ago, one of the biggest terms and phrases that came out of that was automate everything. And of course, if we look at that, it's not possible to automate absolutely everything, but it tended to be the phrase that we would use because it was more of a trigger of, can we automate this? But it wound up being the mantra of a lot of leaders that were looking at cost consciousness and budgets when investing in automation tools or other tools around there, where it became, hey, if I'm going to write a check or have a budget item on this tool, I better see some sort of an ROI. So the idea became is we are going to automate everything. And when we boil that down into how does it apply to QA or QE teams, what really wound up happening was that we tied it to automating what we had previously been calling manual test cases. And I'll kind of use this opportunity to phrase and use a little bit of terminology speak that I hope maybe you'll adopt or take onto your own. So when I think about testing, there are two types of testing. There is scripted testing, and then there is unscripted or exploratory or ad hoc testing, right? So scripted testing, we tend to think of when we use the term script, we tend to think of, oh, automation, a framework, a commercial tool, something like that. Scripted testing really is a set of instructions that is either going to be executed by a machine or a tool or by a person. Those are traditional test cases in there, right? So we have scripted testing taking place of both automated or perhaps non automated, but a set of instructions that would be executed by one or the other. Then we have our unscripted testing. This is really where we, as QE practitioners and experts, we really want to be focusing on the unscripted area as much as we can, because that's where we're exploring the software and stepping into that user advocacy role of how will our users feel. Will they be delighted or will they be frustrated by using our software? If we're focusing on only the scripted testing here, we are missing out on a lot. So I always advocate for these being at the same exact level. Unscripted testing is just as important as scripted testing, either from an automated framework or tool or from a traditional test case. They're both important, but these are equally important, and we have to have both of these in order for us to have a comprehensive and holistic testing strategy. So we do that by being early embracers and adopters of technology, as we'd spoken about earlier. So going back to the automate everything, this usually looks like a certain percentage or number, and as I mentioned, of test cases, right? So it would look very similar to, oh, here's our test management tool. We currently have 35,000 test cases, or something like that. You can fill in the blank with the number of test cases. We believe that test automation will be successful if we can say we've automated a certain percentage or number of those 30,000 test cases and simply following the instructions and automating them as if a person who had previously executed that test case just like that, right? And so we started getting into this number of, ooh, you have 85% of all of your test cases that were sitting in this test management tool automated. That must mean we have a very high quality product, right? So we started taking this automate everything, applying it into QA, QE, into that certain percentage or numbers. And we wound up focusing on automating everything. And more importantly, we wound up putting a lot in incentivizing folks who could continue to up that number of test cases. And it simply became a numbers game. So if you have or are currently experiencing that, how can we make this right? So, number one, know your landscape. As a quality engineer, and so most of my career, certainly for the last 15 plus years, has been focused on quality engineering. And I define that very much aligned with other industry experts and thought leaders in the industry. But I define that as a slightly separate, different functionality or practice than traditional quality assurance. It's not simply just replacing the word assurance with engineering. There's a whole mindset around that, but that's a different talk. But really, the premise of a quality engineer is that we are experts in testing all or most types of testing, and we are that resident expert or experts within our project or agile teams that we're working on, right? So that means that we need to know our entire landscape. I guarantee you, you have other folks outside of QA or QE on your project team that is testing. A lot of times that looks like unit or integration tests from a software engineer. But a lot of times it also looks like their individual checks that they do on the code or the solution that they're providing that likely or hardly ever get documented in a place where we can just go back and refer to that. That usually is a conversation, because other than those unit and integration tests or other tests that are automated from a software engineering standpoint, the actual testing of those or validation of those things that are not automated generally do not get documented like our work generally does in either a framework or in a test management tool. But the idea is that we need to know what our individual software engineers are validating on their own so that we have that full landscape, right? So to the left of us, that's where a lot of our collaboration coupling comes from. We should really be very much lockstep in with our software engineer counterparts. But there's also testing that happens either as we are validating our stuff from a QE standpoint and sometimes to the right of us. Think about how your product owner or product manager or that person that accepts the work on behalf, they also have a test bed or a set of steps that they do pretty repeatedly. Generally speaking, not documented so that we can refer to them without having that conversation. So, what we want to do here is not assume that because it's not documented that it's not happening. It's having those conversations and initiating those conversations, then getting the entire landscape of who and what kind of testing is being done outside of the traditional QA/QE strategy here. So consider the unit and integration tests and take action. If you don't know what the unit and integration test strategy or guidelines are, ask. And if there is none, ask why. But don't necessarily assume that we need to have every single test documented or else we assume that it's not happening. Have those conversations and then put together that entire strategy so that you can make the right risk based decisions on where to focus your efforts at as risky or not risky. We should be vetting out and fleshing out all of our risky tests at the beginning, and then we taper down. And as we get closer and closer to deploying, we should be concentrating on those less risky tests. But if we don't know the landscape, we will absolutely wind up introducing duplication of efforts because we haven't been able to have or we don't have that right information to know your landscape. So, know your landscape. When we get into what other types of tests we should do, part of this is that we want to make sure that a smoke test, and I believe everybody probably has the same understanding of that. It might slightly be defined differently, but I think we can all agree that a smoke test generally means pretty critical functionality, something that if any of that functionality what wound up being broken or not working as designed when it was being consumed by our users, that would result in a pretty high priority issue or severity to be fixed, right? So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we start our test automation on that basic building block that we call that smoke test, right? And so we tie our smoke test definition to CRUD actions: create, read, update, delete. If any of those 4 actions apply to that body of work that we're testing, that becomes our smoke test. If any of those don't apply, then our smoke test contains what does apply from those CRUD actions, right? So it's kind of breaking it down because a smoke test should be agreed to not only by our industry, but by everyone else on our team. I bet it would be really hard for us to not be aligned on what a smoke test is if we have that conversation. Then from there, we wind up having a great measurement that we can do that. Of all of the tests that we said could or should be automated, starting with the smoke test, have they been? And so now we start tying a metric and a number to what we set out to do rather than it being arbitrarily defined or given or sent to us. Okay, so where did we go wrong? 3. So we created a siloed and non-embedded team of automation engineers. And again, going back to my previous mistake about several years ago, where I took a lot of all of my instruction from my new leader because I was very grateful that he gave me the promotion. We wound up creating a very siloed team of automation engineers. They were skilled engineers on the tool that we provided. Perhaps they were also skilled automation engineers, but we didn't know it because what we wound up capturing is, hey, we need skilled people who know how to use this particular tool rather than being able to look at a toolbox and look at a challenge or a solution that we were trying to put in and then being able to put in the right tool. We let the tool and the high dollar price of that tool dictate who we hired. And we wound up hiring automation engineers whose only job was to automate those test cases that had previously been written by the QE/QA team in a traditional test management tool. We came in and automated them, right? It wasn't a bad idea at the time it happened, but what wound up happening is that we had a bunch of automation engineers who never were tapped in or embedded within those project teams, those agile project teams in particular, to where they could hear the discussion. So we kind of put them to the wayside and said, okay, your next 60 days or 6 months or 9 months or 12 months is to simply go down this list of test cases in this test management tool and automate them. So we left them out of those highly collaborative and valuable conversations where we were talking about how does an individual developer or engineer or software engineer test and validate their own code. Um, so we wound up suppressing the creativity of otherwise really smart and really creative engineers by giving them a body of work and telling them to simply automate something to get a number high, right? So we lost the ability to collaborate on holistic solutions. So of course we're going to come back around. How did we make it right? So we've started implementing this concept that I came up with a few years ago called test as a service approach. And what we did is we organized those tests the same exact way that the software engineers had been doing it. And this may or may not apply to you, but generally speaking, software engineers have deep expertise in certain areas of the code. There may be some software engineers that have deep expertise in all areas of the code, but that's pretty rare. So the idea of tests as a service is that the tests are centralized, they are available to anyone on the team, again with the right skill set and who can actually kick those off and review them and troubleshoot those. So we did that. And then we centralize them so that anytime they can run them. So it takes the burden off of QA or QE to be running those or running them into the pipeline. We're actually creating this suite of tests that are organized the way a software engineer would be, so that when they're working in a certain area of the code, hey, if you're working in the payments area of the code, here is a suite of tests, automated and sometimes not automated, that we suggest you use to validate your own code before you merge, or at least at the very point after the merge, if those suites are not tied into the pipeline, right? Previously, what wound up happening is that all of the testing, including the kicking off the test automation, would belong solely on QE. So now what we're doing is we're shifting several very key and valuable suites of tests to the developer, and we're allowing them to test their stuff more thoroughly with the guidance from us, because we're creating, or we are partnering with them to create those tests that they will eventually use to validate their code. So we will run those automated scripts multiple times, ideally in the pipeline, but we're also now giving them back to the software engineers or any of the other engineers outside of quality engineers. They can start using those tests to validate, so that all of the onus of testing does not rely solely on QE shoulders. So essentially, that was how we made the wrong number 3 right. So number 4, where did we go wrong? So automation deliverables are owned, executed, and maintained by only the test folks. Go back to that original example of run a huge monolithic suite of tests overnight or after hours. We come in the morning, we look at that one Slack channel where those tests are, we look at the audience in that Slack channel, and it's almost always only QE in there. But certainly, even if there are other folks in there outside of QE, the high majority of the times was that it was QE's responsibility to vet those out, versus, again, tapping into the many brains and the many eyes of the rest of the team in there. So we wound up looking at that, and then when we were selecting other tools, and this actually applies after the big commercial tool debacle that I referenced to earlier, even as we started bringing in more open source tools or freemium tools or something like that, we did that so much in a bubble where by the time we said, okay, great, we have all these automation scripts. Well, if it was in a tool that dev had never heard of or had never had experience in, and we start handing them off to them, well, we didn't really collaborate with them on a better tool, right? So a lot of times we made those decisions in a silo, and then we ultimately would hand those off and say, okay, go out there. Well, if a software engineer was not part of the original conversation on evaluating that tool or hearing about that tool before we handed off tests to them, they were not going to be really receptive to running them, because then they have to learn a new skill set. So we're trying to bridge the gap and make the transition a little bit easy on our quest to both shift left and to really put QE into that position where they are the consultant and the guiding, the expert in all testing, to include test automation, to the point where we are making recommendations to our software engineers as well. So it wound up becoming the responsibility of one practice or one person rather than the entire team. We weren't treating automation code or automation deliverables like team deliverables, like all of our other counterparts wind up having in there, right? So how did we wind up making this one right? So we use the leave no trace approach, right? So first of all, we leave things in a state as if you weren't, or more importantly, can't be there. So we need to put in guidelines and adherence around when we automate something. If the idea is to use the test as a service approach, that means that that should be able to be used by folks outside of the QE team that created it. So we have to put in those extra types of what we call prime time guidelines to be able to do that. So we want to leave those in a state where you, as the automation person or the person that created those suites of tests, if you need to take time off, or if you go to another team, that those are left in a state where the team, it becomes an archive and it becomes an artifact of that work that continues to move on and still adds value for the team, regardless of whether you are there to kick them off, review the results or not. So now what? So hopefully some of these, maybe all of these wrongs probably apply to you, or they have applied to you at some point in time in your career. But more importantly, how do you make those right? So things that I like to capture now are start small. Instead of going after the easy or the big types of tests, or by automating based off of existing test cases, determine and define what a smoke test is, and make sure that that definition is understood and agreed to by everybody on the team, not just from the QE or the QA folks. Focus on a smoke test. Feel free to use that way that we described it, which is that CRUD functionality, or CRUD actions: create, read, update, delete. That's been a really big success for us. Tie it to your definition of done. The automation of that smoke test and it running in the pipeline and being available to be used by multiple members of the team outside of QE, we've actually tied that to our own definition of done. We do not move that ticket over to the next column until that is done. So we've tied the automation of a smoke test to the completion of that story from QE, rather than come back around at the next sprint or for future sprints and have a huge amount of tech backlog or tech debt that we've created in there. We're tying that initial test automation to the completion of that story. Think like a team member, even if you're not embedded. Many of you may support multiple teams in there, but think like the team member. What would you want your team to be able to do so that you're not always the one that's being asked the questions of, how do I kick this off again? Where are those results again? How do I troubleshoot this? Leave no trace. And when you exit off of a project where you want to start pushing some of the responsibilities out to the team where they should belong so that you can focus on other things, think about that leave no trace rule or that approach. Your goal should be to provide those self-service tests for anyone on the team to use, so that it's ultimately owned and maintained by the team, even if you, the person who created them, are no longer on that team. So that allows for you to focus on innovation driven by change, and that you can also right the wrongs. So with that said, here's my contact information. I believe that there are some questions here, so I am ready, willing, and able to answer as many as come my way.
Thank you, Melisaa, for this wonderful session. And glad to understand your experiences and your inputs and your journey, as you shared. And it's very rare that somebody shares their own failures and what went wrong, uh, uh, and that could help the QA community at large out here. um, there were some comments and some questions by the forum who or participants who joined, but
Right.
I'll be a little I'll be a little this that I'll want to ask you a question myself as well. I'm the other day I was working in a shared workspace where in the cafeteria I was just having my lunch, and I overheard one of the QA team members talking, QA interns in fact, talking to a engineering manager, uh, and the way he mentioned was that uh, that he was reporting directly to the engineering manager rather than a director of QA, and he was asking the person, why doesn't he have a director of QA helping him out? And I've seen this trend nowadays, like as people are adopting a lot of shift left, companies now focus on dev managers, directing the QA teams in small spaces. What are your thoughts on that? Do you see that this could lead to a gap in terms of a good direction from the QA perspective?
That's a great question. I've seen it, right? I actually have another talk where I talk about the three types of approaches to QA: hybrid, self serve, embedded, all that kind of stuff, which because it is such a timely topic.
Yeah.
Um, I have worked in both. I certainly, as a QE leader, most of my career as a QE leader has been in a more centralized type of approach where we have QA managers or we have the function and practice of QA or testing into a centralized leader or organization, right? But I've also consulted and I have left companies with the expectation that I would exit myself so that we could have the centralized practice of testing, that we would have an adoption by whoever was managing the people responsible for that. So there's a lot of success in either one. I would say there's probably less success in the engineering managers owning both the all of the engineering to include the software architecture and quality engineering things. The only reason is that I've seen firsthand that when schedules get tight or there's pressure on, testing is the one thing that winds up falling to the wayside, and an engineering manager will tend to advocate more for the software engineering practice than the testing, because we as quality engineers are dependent on software engineers to write code that we test, right? Like no one, everybody knows, understands where we are in the dependency there. I mean, it should be a mutual collaboration, but we don't have testing until there is code in there. So I have not seen a lot of success where engineering managers own that, because it winds up becoming a non-consistent practice, because it then gets that individual engineering manager will influence the practice of testing based off of her or his experience rather than a centralized practice. Now, there are other options where you can still have a centralized practice of QA without a traditional QA or QE leader, but that's really hard to do because you don't really have anyone owning it. You have collective people owning it, but without that named practice leader owning it, it just really becomes hard. And I experienced that, 2 3 years ago, where it was a lot of cleanup to do in order to get it back into a centralized practice, even without that centralized leader.
Fantastic, Melissa. In the interest of time, I just have one more question from the chat. That as these days, as QEs become more seasoned, become like more product experts, they often end up orchestrating the entire testing process, like product grooming, environment readiness, DevOps, deployments, and a lot more. Do you think a, there could be a tool that could be better than utilizing the QE bandwidth for orchestrating the test activities?
I think I'm a big fan of using AI to create checklists of things that are things that should naturally be part of it, right? So the way that I think about it now is that we're using yes, I believe that there could be a tool in there. I tend to lean on ChatGPT or similar to do that. I think we look at it more like a checklist as well, right? Like there are certain things that must happen anytime we touch production, right? And those policies and standards should really never there should really never be an exception on it. And if there is an exception, it's not one person being able to make that decision for the multitudes. It needs to be a true an exception process in there. So in that case, I tend to say I always advocate for QA or QE to be in those conversations, but to also participate in those conversations not as somebody who's consuming the information, but who's actively contributing to the conversation and giving information that is consumed by others. So I think that's really the balance there is that when you participate in those conversations, it's very apparent when you don't have the right information that others do because you're tending to not be as vocal in those conversations. So when I'm looking at meetings like that, I tend to look at the process of, hey, what information do others have that QE or QA did not get previous to this meeting? And so fix those and then come back around and create a process to be able to support it consistently and recurringly from team to team to team.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Melisaa. Thank you for answering
Yeah.
that. And thank you so much for this insightful session. And I'm sure, the participants have learned a lot from your experience.
My
Thank you once again. And I also want to remind all the attendees that this session will be recorded and it will be available on the Lambda Test YouTube channel. Thank you, everyone.
Enjoy the rest of the conference.